This is Laurie Moore-Moore with Texas Brave and Strong. Tidbits of Texas history you never learned in school. Today's episode is something a little different. I'm going to share an excerpt from an old book written in 1870 entitled The Adventures of Big-Foot Wallace, the Texas Ranger and Hunter, written by John Duval. First, let me introduce you to Bigfoot. Bigfoot's real name was William Alexander Anderson Wallace. Not only was his name big, his feet were too. In a time when the average man stood 5 feet 5½ inches tall, Bigfoot was 6 feet 2 inches and weighed well over 200 pounds. In short, he was a mountain of a man, famous for his exploits as a Texas Ranger in the Texas frontier. In his book, author Duval, who was Bigfoot's best friend, writes of Bigfoot Wallace's experiences using Wallace's own voice. I hope you'll enjoy it. I've titled this episode, Texas Ranger Bigfoot Wallace Meets His Match. The resulting hand-to-hand fight is a fight to the death. In the fall of 1842, Indians were worse on the frontier than they'd ever been before or since. You couldn't stake a horse out at night with any expectation of finding him next morning, and a fellow's scalp wasn't safe on his head outside of his own shanty. People on the frontier at last came to the conclusion that something had to be done, or else they'd be compelled to fall back on the settlements, which would have been a reversing of the natural order of things. So we collected by agreement at my ranch, organized a company of 40 men, and the next time the Indians came down from the mountains, we took the trail, determined to follow it as long as our horses could hold out. Trail led us up toward the headwaters of the Llano River, and on the third day I was out discovering a great many smoke signals rising up a long distance off in the direction we were traveling. That night we camped near a water hole and put out a double guard. Just before the sun went down, I saw a smoke apparently about 3 miles to the northeast of us and felt satisfied there was a party of Indians in camp there. So I went to the captain and told him if he could give me leave to do so, I would get up an hour or two before daylight and find out whether there were any Indians there or not. He was willing enough to let me go and told the guard to pass me out whenever I wanted to leave. I whetted up old Butcher a little, rammed 2 bullets down the throat of Sweet Lips, his guns, and left camp about 2 hours before daylight and started off in the direction of the smoke I had seen the evening before. The chaparral was thick in some places as the hair on a dog's back, but I scuffled through it in the dark, and after traveling through it 1.5 miles, I came to a deep canyon that seemed to head up in the direction I'd seen the smoke. I scrambled down into it and waited until day began to break, then slowly and cautiously continued my course along the bottom of the canyon. It was crooked, and in some places so narrow that there was scarcely room enough in it for 2 men to travel abreast. At length, I came to a place where it made a sudden bend to the left, and just as I turned the corner, I came plump up against a big Indian who was coming down the canyon, I suppose with the intention of spying out our camp. We were both stooping down when we met, and our heads came together with considerable force, and the Indian rolled one way and I the other. We both rose about the same time, and so unexpected was the encounter that we stood for a moment uncertain what to do, and stood glaring upon one another like 2 wildcats when they're about to dispute the carcass of a dead deer. The Indian had a gun as well as I, but we were too close to each other to shoot, and it seemed we both came to the conclusion as to what was best to be done about the same time, for we both dropped our rifles and grappled each other, saying not a word. You see, boys, I'm a pretty stout man yet, but in those days, without meaning to brag, I do not believe there was a white man west of the Colorado River that could stand up against me in a regular wildcat bear hug hand-to-hand fight. But the minute I hefted that Indian, I knew I had undertaken a job that would bring the sweat from me and perhaps blood, too. He was nearly as tall as I am, say 6 feet 1 or 2 inches, and would weigh, I suppose, about 175 pounds net, for he had no clothes on worth mentioning. I had the advantage of him in weight, but he was as wiry and active as a cat and as sleek as an eel, and no wonder either, for he was greased from head to foot with bear's oil. At it we went, in just downright earnest, without a word being spoken by either one of us. First up one side the canyon, down in the bottom, then up the other side, and the dust flew in such a way that had one been passing along the bank above, they would have supposed that a small whirlwind was raging below. I was, however, a little stronger of the two, and when we rose to our feet I could throw him easily enough. But the moment he touched the ground, the varmint would give himself a sort of a squirm, like a snake, and pop right up on top of me, and I could not hold him still a moment, he was so sleek with bear grease. Each one of us was busy trying to draw his butcher knife from the sheath all the time, but neither could get the chance to do it. At last, I found that my breath was failing me, and I came to the conclusion that if I did not do something soon, I should have my note taken to a certainty, for the Indian was like a wolf and was getting better the longer he fought. So the next time we rose, I put out all my strength and gave him a backhanded trip that brought his head with great force against a sharp-pointed rock that was lying on the ground. He was completely stunned by the shock for an instant, and before he fairly came to, I snatched my knife from the sheath and drove it with all my strength up to the hilt in his body. The moment he felt the cold steel, he threw me from him as if I had been a 10-year-old boy, sprang upon me before I could rise, drew his own butcher knife, and raised it above his head with the intention of plunging it into my breast. I tell you what, boys, I often see that Indian now in my dreams, particularly after eating a hearty supper of bear meat and honey, grappling me by the throat with his left hand and his glittering butcher knife raised in his right, his two fierce eyes gleaming like a panther's in the dark. It's astonishing how fast a man can think under such circumstances. He thinks faster than words can fly along one of those newfangled telegraph lines. I looked toward the blue sky above me and bid it a long farewell, and to the green trees, the sparkling water, and the bright sun. Then I thought of my mother as I remembered her when I was a little boy, the old home, the apple orchard, the brook where I used to fish for minnows, and the commons where I used to ride every stray donkey and pony I could catch. And then I thought of Alice Ann, a blue-eyed, partridge-built young woman I had a leaning to, who lived down in the Zumwalt settlement. All these and many more thoughts beside flashed through my mind in the little time that knife was gleaming over my breast. All at once, the Indian gave a keen yell, and down went the knife with such force that it was buried to the hilt in the hard earth at my side. The last time I had thrown the Indian down, a deep gash had been cut in his forehead by the sharp-pointed rock, and the blood running down into his eyes from the wound blinded him so that he missed his aim. I fully expected he would repeat the blow, but he lay still and made no effort to draw his knife from the ground. I looked at his eyes, and they were closed hard and fast, but there was a devilish sort of grin still about his mouth, as if he had died in the belief that he had sent me before him to the happy hunting grounds. I threw him off of me, and he tumbled down to the bottom of the canyon, stone dead. My knife had gone to his heart. I looked at him some time, lying there so still and stiffening fast in the cool morning air, and said to myself, "Well, old fellow, you made a good fight of it anyhow, and if luck had not been against you, you would have taken my sign-in to a certainty, and Alice Ann would have lost the best string she's got to her bow." And now I said to myself, "Old fellow, I'm going to do for you what I never did for an Indian before. I am going to give you a decent Christian burial." So I broke his gun into a dozen pieces and laid them beside him, according to the Indian custom, so it might be handy for him when he got to the happy hunting grounds, though if they haven't first-rate blacksmiths there, I don't think it will be fit for use soon. And then I pulled up some pieces of rock from the canyon and piled them around and over him until he was completely covered and safe from the attacks of the coyotes and other animals. And there, I have no doubt, his bones are to this day. This is a true account of my fight with the big Indian in the canyon. Signed, Bigfoot Wallace. This has been Laurie Moore-Moore with Texas Brave and Strong, the best little podcast in Texas. New episodes twice each month. Find Texas Brave and Strong on most major podcast sites and on my website, lauriemooremore.com. Be sure to check out my Texas historical novel, Gone to Dallas, The Storekeeper, 1856 to 1861. Thanks for listening. Y'all come back.